guys, and welcome to my monthly Q&A. Thank you so much for joining me. So we're going to start off by answering the first question, which is how is the market? And as you guys know, obviously the market's been strong, demand is still high, and we're still seeing multiple offers. And I want to touch a little bit on why that has been. We've obviously discussed a lot about how interest rates are still historically low, and so that's really driven up demand in the past years. But a couple other things that I think we've overlooked is the fact that vacation homes have become a really hot commodity. And as the chief economist at NAR has pointed out, the reason for that is mainly because a lot of people are exploring their work from home options. And since that has become a really big thing since the pandemic, people have been able to enjoy their vacation homes while still working remotely. A lot of people have moved to different locations that are not necessarily close to their main office because they're able to now work from different locations. So we see people moving out of state or out of areas where they normally would work because they're able to work remotely. Another big thing that I think is driving up the demand is something that is a really big thing here. Millennials are the biggest cohort demographic. And millennials traditionally have been known to put off a lot of their big lifetime milestones, such as getting married and having children and buying homes, mainly due to the fact that they want to further their education and have established jobs. So in the past 40 years, the average age of homeowners has been much lower than it's been in the past 40 years. So we're now looking at people making these choices much later on in life. However, we're now at the peak of when the millennials are entering this part of their life. So they are now entering the home buying and big lifestyle choices in full force, and that is really driving up demand. We're seeing a lot of younger people entering the home ownership, and Gen Z is right behind them. So what we have right now is increased demand simply because a big cohort is just now entering the market, whereas in prior years you see families doing that much earlier in their life, whereas right now the millennials are just now entering that peak in their life. So the second question that I got is, how do rent backs work? And this is an important question. I actually had a situation like this in one of my recent transactions. So let's just say you have a seller that wants to sell their property but is still looking to remain in the property for a couple months after the close of escrow because they need to find a place to move, they're in escrow on a property that they're buying, and so forth. So there are several options. One of them is you can just extend the escrow and then they close escrow concurrently with their home purchase or once they've already moved out of the property. But a lot of the times these sellers need the money to move on to their next property. So what they do is they request to close early and then they rent back their own property. Now, what's significant about this is that you need to understand sellers can ask to stay in their own property rent-free, or they can offer to pay a rental amount, or they can offer to pay basically the mortgage that the buyer is paying once the escrow closes. So there are several different ways that can happen. But what I think is important to know, being on the buyer's end of this transaction, is that if you do have a seller that wants to stay in their property, we want to make sure that they actually move out when they say they do. We want to make sure that once they move out, the property is actually clear and delivered in broom swept condition or whatever condition you guys have agreed upon. And a big part of that is making sure that they're held accountable by leaving a deposit. And one of the issues I had was that if there's a rent back, you need to make sure that the lender is on board with it, because sometimes the buyer's lender has issues with it, especially if the rent back is longer than 30 days. So you need to make sure that you can hold a deposit. You need to make sure that the lender is okay with it, and you need to make sure that before the deposit is released, that you have the property in the condition that you want it, and that the tenant or the seller, who is the tenant in this case, has actually moved out. And I think it's really important that you have an agent that has those interests for you in mind, because it gets very messy if the the seller overstays his welcome, and if there's no deposit to be held in place, and if the escrow didn't take care of holding that deposit and paying the buyer the rent that they were supposed to pay them. The last question I have is from a seller who wants to sell their property. Their property is a fixer. It's a property that they've inherited, and it needs work. So they wanted to know, will I get more money if I sell it to an investor or if I sell it to a regular homeowner occupier? So the question here really is, how much work does the property need? Now, if the property needs really everything, and in some situations can't even be financed because the property is in such dilapidated condition, your best bet is to go with an investor, because for a home buyer to pay all cash because they can't finance the transaction, it's going to be very difficult to find a home buyer that's going to be living in the property that has all cash and that has the capabilities and the desire to put in that much money to remodel it. You also need to remember that when you remodel a property, you're remodeling it in cash most of the time. You can obviously get hard money or get construction loans, but when a home buyer is looking to develop a property, they want to make sure that they usually want to make sure that they have the reserves to actually develop it. So depending on the condition of the house, I think that your target audience will be different. And if it's a light fixer, you're going to have a lot of homeowners who want to come in, develop it, and remodel it in their specific style, their specific taste, and they're willing to pay top dollar to do it the way that they like, especially if they have a green thumb and they have their own style and connections and want to do it the way that they want to do it. However, if the property has major structural issues, it's going to be very difficult to find a traditional buyer who is up for that kind of challenge. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but investors are a lot more prone to taking those kind of risks because there's a big can of worms that home buyers are usually scared to take on when they take on such a big project. So, conceptually, yes, home buyers will usually pay more because they're living in the property and they have equity. But a lot of the times the home buyers take into consideration that they need to put that money in cash, and it's easier for them to just get it in a loan once the property is remodeled. They also have much more risk involved, and so they might be much more risk averse and offer lower because they don't know what it's going to actually take them to remodel it. And lastly, developers that remodel properties at much lower costs than home buyers do. The retail price for a remodel is very different than the cost it will take an investor to remodel the property, and that's where their bread and butter is. That's where the investors make their money. So they might offer similar amounts knowing that they can make their money in the profit, because the home buyer would have to pay much higher amount to remodel the property, whereas developers have their own teams, have their own contractors already on staff, and so they have easier time remodeling, and they have a much easier time when things come up and knowing how to deal with them. So obviously you want to appeal to as many people as possible, and you don't want to limit your target audience, but at the same time, when you have such a big project, such as a big fixer, you want to make sure that the person who's buying it can actually close the transaction if it needs to be in cash, if there are things that come up in inspections, that they don't get scared easily. So that's why sometimes when you have a big fixer, it's much easier to just approach investors as opposed to hoping that a home buyer will look past all of these issues. But there are no rules, and anything can happen. There's a buyer for everything. So yeah, that's basically it. Thank you guys again for joining me. It's good seeing you every month and hearing your questions. If you need anything, you know where to find me. Thanks so much.